established 40 years ago. So please transfer 1 million, quote now, to entertain the members of a court, to have a party, in other words. I mean, this is not the thing the European citizens are expecting us to do. I'm not going to criticize further, you know my attitudes, but I would love Mr. Ashworth, Deprez and others to give the next year rapporteurs the data of all the transfers in order to make some sense in the end. And let me finish with a quote of Sir Paul McCartney: "We shouldn't quarrel about money because money can't buy me love." This is to provoke Mr. Farage because he might have a different opinion.
Well, thank you very much for the light relief and for making my job easier. And now for 2.5 minutes, the unprovoked Mr. Farage.
Thank you very much. Oh, I enjoyed that. Let's hear it for Commissioner Oettinger, the German Commissioner in charge of the European Union budget. You, sir, are having a very good day. Christmas has come early. You must be delighted. The British government is going to shell out a cool 50 billion as part of our exit proceedings, which, if you think about it, is all really rather odd, isn't it? Because the 23rd of June 2016 wasn't just significant politically, it was significant for the European Union budget. We've been a net contributor into the EU budget every single year since 1973. For most of those years, we've been the second biggest contributor, and we pay in 16% of the total European Union budget. But of course, we're leaving. So logic says, if, for example, a family has an annual income and that income declines, they then have cheaper holidays. They then cut their cloth according to their circumstances. And yet, when we look at the 2018 budget, all the Commission projections going on for the next few years, we see that absolutely no account is being taken of the British leaving the European Union. You've decided to simply carry on regardless, and it would appear that in a very weak moment, the British Prime Minister has decided to bail you out for it. Well, I would just say, don't bank on it, because I think there is going to be a huge public reaction to this extraordinary sum of money. Honestly, I do. I think there is a real prospect of there being a big rebellion within the Conservative Party against their own leader. So don't think this is absolutely guaranteed. And certainly the line that I've always taken is that no deal is better than a bad deal. And in this case, it's worse than a bad deal because we don't even know if we're going to get a trade deal in return. Even if there was a firm offer of tariff-free access to the EU single market, it would not be worth the 50 billion payment. So celebrate for today, Commissioner, but I promise you, it's not in the bag.
Mr. Farage, there is a blue card request from Mr. Mureşan, our rapporteur. Do you accept? Please, Mr. Mureşan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farage, for accepting this blue card. Mr. Farage, for sure, the challenges that the UK budget is facing for next year are much bigger than the challenges that the EU budget is facing for next year. Your revenues are going down, your growth perspective is worsening, investments will be at a slower level in the United Kingdom next year, not in Europe. The question which I would like to ask you is, are you aware we have increased budget of the Union for next year primarily for research and innovation? Are you aware how much UK universities are benefiting from this? And are you aware who is the biggest beneficiary, which country is the biggest beneficiary of EU research funds? Thank you very much.
The fact that the Office of Budget Responsibility is giving a bearish prognosis for the UK economy doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. You know, we had lots of people, lots of big organisations telling us that if we didn't join the euro, we were headed for ruin, and thank God we didn't do it. Yes, I am aware of the extent to which our money, recycled through the European Union, comes back to British universities. And some of it comes back to be very well spent in research. And I acknowledge that, and I understand that. But equally, much of it comes back to fund things like Jean Monnet professorships in British universities to teach a completely slanted, distorted view of history. We'd rather spend the money ourselves. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think for clarification, the House would agree that the United Kingdom is still a full member of the European Union and remains so until the end of March 2019. I now move on for the next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Marušik.
Thank you very much, President. Working on this budget, I encountered many people who seemed very happy about the fact that this budget is so large and it is growing so fast. But I am looking at this with growing concern because it looks like a patient who is very happy having a huge tumor in his body which is growing very rapidly. And the body does not react. It treats it like its own tissue. But the tumor treats the body like a parasite treats a host. It wants to destroy it. So how much can I say about it within 1 minute? Well, I can say what Alexis Orbas said in the famous movie. What a beautiful catastrophe, what a beautiful disaster. And the scripture, the Bible, says pride comes before the fall. Europe is cracking under the weight of this budget, and it is a very, very sad thing. Obviously, the European politicians stopped reading the Bible. Thank you very much.
2 minutes, Mr. Fernandes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I extend my greetings to the representatives of Council and Commission, and I would address to them and all my colleagues thanks, and also I would make an observation. You've done a huge job of work, and it's right to recollect that. In particular, Mr. Mureşan, Mr. Ashworth and the entire negotiating team led by the chairman of the Budget Committee, who together have allowed us to consolidate our priorities and ensure that the agencies too saw a strengthening of their wherewithal. Priority on cooperation and competitiveness, youth employment, young farmers support for SMEs, enhanced security in the EU, and also a strengthening of the organisations fighting terrorism, more solidarity and so on. All these have been taken on board. We've managed to reinstate over £1 billion of cuts from Council and reinvest them in research and innovation under Horizon 2020, and to improve support for SMEs under the COSME programme, and to enhance the youth guarantee. However, we haven't resolved all the problems in this budget. Obviously not, because this budget, apart from anything else, only amounts to about 1% of EU GNI. However, it does make up 94% of investment, and only 6% of the budget is spent on overheads. In a country like mine, over 70% of public investment is made up by EU funds. National competences remain in the member states, and national budgets therefore have to do their bit too. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Thoma, you have 2 minutes.
Mrs. Thoma needs a microphone, please.
It's okay? Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. No, of course, I would also like to sincerely thank our rapporteurs, Marisha and Mr. Guy and Mr. Ashworth, for the work they've carried out, and also thank the Commissioner and his team. After the negotiations, I just wanted to point out some good news. Real increases obtained by the Parliament, 110 million for Horizon 2020 to invest in the future, 54 million for Erasmus, 116 on the youth guarantee. So I'm reassured. The mid-term review that we were so committed to is a real review and not just a veil of smoke. However, we have to admit that these sparks are not enough to shed light on this drop for agriculture, nothing, no increase for humanitarian, and only $1.5 million for culture. And I also regret the cavalier method with which the negotiations took place. The Parliament should not put up with this. It's no longer acceptable for the Council to only present its position a few days before the deadline, sort of putting the knife at the throat of the Parliament. So it's difficult to accept that the ministers hardly deign to negotiate the budget, and they only do something after midnight, and the ambassadors leave when there's still crucial points to discuss. But how to put up with the insincerity of the Council, which we've seen in this budget, by trying to conserve extravagant margins in order to finance later on the facility for Turkey, while saying, of course, that there's a decrease in the pre-accession budget. So the list is long, but, well, the budget isn't there, and the S&D will not be able to support this budget. I've suggested that the Parliament refuse to negotiate in negotiations before the Council has a clear mandate. And especially, I would like to see the Council and Parliament be able to define a budget based on real needs and not on national egotism and hidden projects, and with funny funding coming out of the own resources. Thank you very much.
Madam, there is a blue card from Mr. Rubik. Will you accept? Madam? Mr. Rubik.
Yes, of course.
Yes, 30 seconds, please.
Yes, many thanks to Mrs. Thomas. I think at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I have to congratulate you, you insisted on this 350 million for youth employment, for the young people. And I think it's a big progress which we achieved in front of Council and Commission. So I'm now interested, will you tomorrow vote in favor for this 350 million for the young people, for the workforce, for their future?
Madame.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rubik. Well, first of all, we'd have to be sure that this 250 million are not a front-loading and are a real step forward. That's not too clear yet. And then to answer specifically your question, tomorrow we are going to abstain.
And now 1 minute for Mr. Kuzmiuk.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner. I would like to point out that under the obligation payments, compared to this year, the growth is symbolic, 0.2%. But payments have grown more significantly, but 14%. But one could think this growth might be insufficient because we are entering the second phase of implementation of the multi-annual perspective for the years 2014-2020, and all beneficiaries are now accelerating the implementation of projects which are being financed from the European budget. The point is that we should avoid the backlog of payments, the problem we had in the years 2012-2014, when at the end of the previous perspective we had over 30 billion of backlog of invoices. Let me remind you that payments for next year at 145 billion euros are 3 billion lower than the actual payments conducted in 2013 at the height of the crisis when we had the backlog last time round. Thank you.
Thank you. For 4 minutes now, Madam Yatamaki.
Arvoisa rouva.
Madam President, the ALDE Group supports the work of the Conciliation Committee, and tomorrow we will be asking in favor of the adoption of the budget. I believe that we are able, through this budget, to accelerate the European economy that is seeing a positive trend. We are putting a lot of effort and investment to cut youth unemployment and in order to promote opportunities for SMEs. We are also making progress when it comes to increasing the share of climate funding. However, it has to be said, unfortunately, that we are still not fulfilling the targets of the Paris Climate Conference. That target was to have a 20% budget share for climate funding. I hope that when we will be drafting and presenting the next annual budgets, in that case the Commission should make sure that the budget is in line with our commitments. Madam President, we think that we are making the right solution to cut Turkey's pre-accession funds with 105 million euros. Human rights and the rule of law are essential European values. I'm satisfied that we are now sending a strong political message to Ankara, and we don't just follow on the sidelines when this development goes into a worrying direction in that country. Dear colleagues, our citizens often evaluate the acceptability of the EU from the point of view of its use of funds. I was our group's negotiator, and I am more and more convinced that we need a clearer and more transparent EU budget and the use of funds. If we continue as we have done by now, we cannot build a sustainable trust into our union. The next years won't be easy from the point of view of our budget. The UK is leaving, and thus the biggest net contributor is leaving us. The EU and we have to be able to reform and also make cuts and have new investments. The majority of Parliament wants a bigger and bigger budget all the time. Many member states disagree. We have to find a solution for this. The Union's priorities change, and we need to find sufficient funding for new priorities. This cannot mean, however, that we only have more and more priorities all the time. In that case, we don't have any priorities at all. Everything is equal in value. So we need to find savings and reprioritize. In this work, we decision makers have a lot to improve. To finish, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Mureşan, from his excellent work. He was very cooperative. Thank you.
Thank you. And 2 minutes now, Mr. Arnott.
We're here today, Madam President, to debate the agreement on the European Union budget for 2018, but it would seem to me that the European Union budgets for 2019, 2020 and, as far as is reasonably foreseeable into the future, might just as well have also been agreed. The United Kingdom has been a net contributor to the European Union since we joined it in the 1970s, and as one of the richer countries in Europe, as members we've always paid in more than we've got out, and we'll continue to do so again in 2018 because those are the rules and because we're still members, despite the fact that by the end of 2018 it'll be 2.5 years since the UK voted to leave the EU in that referendum. And of course, according to this budget, we'll still be paying in over £18 billion a year gross, and then get back roughly half of that in rebate and EU funding. Bizarrely, though, it seems that the UK will still be paying into the European Union after leaving the EU, whether it's £40 billion or £50 billion, 45 or 55 billion euros. The UK has no legal liability whatsoever to pay any form of divorce bill. And of course, if you have an agreement, then you expect something in return for your money. Yet Theresa May has surrendered that. She's expected to surrender to on the Northern Ireland border and to surrender to allow European courts jurisdiction over the EU post-Brexit, which is what we voted to get out of in the first place. The killer question, though, for the British Prime Minister is this. Can you show us one single thing that you've actually obtained in return? Show us one concession that's been made on the EU side, because all we see is you caving in whilst British Remain politicians egg you on. Of course you can't. So in 2018, the British taxpayer will continue to foot the bill. And when it comes to that divorce bill, that's the equivalent of £1,000 for every adult in the UK, without any guarantee of anything in return that has been signed up to by Theresa May.
There is a blue card. Mr. Frunzulică.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I may ask my colleague, Mr. Arnott, don't you think so that UK, as a civilized European country that is sharing the European values, that is defending and promoting the European values, should have to pay its normal bill and to remain in close relationship with Europe, as you are intending to have access to the common market and to the customs union of the European Union?
Of course, in any negotiation, you want a little bit of give and take. You want something to happen on both sides. But what we've got at the moment is all give from the British Prime Minister's side and all take from the European Union side. When you start from the legal basis on this, where the treaties under Article 50, subsection 3 of the Lisbon Treaty says that the treaties shall cease to apply, that overrides all other things. The hierarchy of norms applies. So there is no legal requirement for the UK to pay. Of course, if you leave and services have already been provided, then there's a reason to say, yes, pay something for that. But of course, there are arguments on both sides, and the UK could easily take aim, for example, as a share of the European Investment Bank. Sorry.
And now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Ellison.
Voorzitter.
Madam President, once again, we're discussing the EU budget for 2018. Supported by the Europhiles in this House. I think those who are in favour of the budget should show what they're really trying to achieve. Instead of saving taxpayers' money, they want to introduce an EU budget and spend even beyond the 1% of GDP in Europe and levy their own taxes. But we think this is a national sovereignty issue and that has to be respected, including by the President of Parliament. We think this is part of the subsidiarity principle, which apparently the left wing of this House doesn't care about. We think that there might be possibilities of making some savings in this huge budget. For example, saving on the internal organisation, the very generous salaries, and all this travelling between Brussels and Strasbourg. We don't believe, as the President of the Parliament does, that €150 billion extra is going to solve the problems of EU borders being overrun by refugees. And I wonder where the President of Parliament thinks he has the legitimation to call for levying of an EU tax or the doubling of the budget. Has he got a mandate for that from the majority of this Parliament? Who was he speaking on behalf of? He certainly wasn't speaking on behalf of our group.
And now 2 minutes, Madam Weider.
Godātie kolēģi, es vēlos sākt.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Mr. Mureşan very warmly. He has done a very professional job of work. Over the last couple of months in the Budget Committee, we've worked very hard. On the 18th of November, Latvia's National Day, Council and Parliament agreed on the budget. What do we aim to achieve with it? Asked the last speaker. Well, specifically, we want hard and fast projects, not castles in the sky. We want to make our universities and economies more competitive, and we want to allow our companies to compete better on the world market. 350 million euros are being allocated to COSME, and Horizon 2020 will get 11 billion euros, and the Connecting Europe facility as well will maintain its financing. The Council wanted to cut 200 million. Next year, the European infrastructure projects will receive almost 2 billion euros, and the project I'm thinking of in particular is Rail Baltic, not just for the Baltic countries but of importance to Europe as a whole. I'm very happy that my pilot project that I've been involved in will receive 800,000 euros looking into cross-European issues. High quality projects are required. Mr. Juncker referred to that, and also the pilot project fighting fake news from Russia will receive 1.1 million. I'm very happy that we will get enough financing in order to be able to draw attention to this issue. This is not too much money. It's just a starting point, and Europe's future hangs on it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for 1 minute, Madam Gardia Zabal.
Thank you, President. 3 quick messages because I only have a minute. 1, to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Muresan, and the other rapporteurs for the work that they've done. They've done very serious work, and they've defended the position agreed on by the Parliament very well. 2, an evaluation of the result of the conciliation. Well, we think that there are some similar results to earlier years, not better or worse. We've improved things for certain programs, but we do think that a lot more could be done. And that's why that brings me to the 3rd message, because the Socialist Group is going to abstain in the vote tomorrow, and we'd like to explain why. As I said, not because we aren't pleased with the work of the rapporteur, not because we think that it's a result this is worse than in early years, but we feel that we have to look at the way these meetings take place. You can't negotiate in one day, in 16 hours at 4 o'clock in the morning, a serious budget. You can't leave payments on the table without debating them. You can't talk about protests like that have been put forward, and we couldn't talk about the European Solidarity Corps. So we just want to point this out to the Council, and we hope that next year things will change.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Huitema.
Beste collega's.
Colleagues, Commissioner, I am happy that the European Parliament's position to raise funds for the budget 2018 was not successful. I think we in the European Parliament need to be a lot more critical about the way EU money is spent. We need to ensure that money is spent well and that citizens should pay as little tax as possible. Not all of the money that the EU receives from the taxpayer ought actually, per definition, have to be spent. I think that the income shouldn't define expenditure. I think money should be more carefully spent. If you're spending more on one policy, you have to save on another. I hope that this policy will apply to the new multi-annual financial framework. I think clearer priorities have to be established, particularly when the budget starts to be smaller as a result of Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Tsani.
Thank you, Madam President. 3 very quick points on this agreement. Firstly, a general political point to do with Turkey. Finally, albeit with little conviction on the figures, a decision has been made to cut the funds. For 4 years in the Budget Committee, I've been calling for action on the Turkish pre-accession funding, and the answer I've always got is that it was a problem that, for technical reasons, couldn't be dealt with because of the regulation and so on. This approach, this cut, demonstrates that where there's the political will, above all in the big groups, there are no rules which prevent us from making cuts. You just need the political will to make cuts to funding which is wrong. And I hope that over forthcoming months and budgets there'll be a decision to make further cuts in this kind of funding. And the last point, which shocks me about Russian propaganda, is the fact that there'll be €1 million spent on fighting Russian fake news. Well, I wonder about limitations on freedom here. Who decides what's true and what's false, and on what criteria?
Mr. Tsani, there's a blue card. Will you accept the blue card? Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. Zani. This money that's being spent on propaganda, I'd like to know if you think that there is far too much European propaganda by the European Parliament, such as the House of History. I call it the House of Horrors. It doesn't seem to relate to any reality I know of. Don't you think that money should be cut from that budget, instead of spending a lot of money saying how wonderful the European Union is and how wonderful the President is, the Chairman and all the rest of it? What do you think?
That's precisely the point I was trying to bring out. Who decides what is true and what is false? Who decides that information from outside the EU is propaganda? Is there some body checking information that the EU is circulating in schools? demonstrating this to be a perfect institution free of any flaws. That's a real point. Who decides what's true and what's false? It's very dangerous. The EU spends money on information that no one checks, many millions of euro every year, and therefore I think that's the point that needs to be borne in mind.
Thank you. Just an observation, Mr. Coburn. In our history, there were many horrors. I think colleagues would agree with that. And before I give the floor now for 2 minutes to Mr. Albrecht. Thank you.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Panie Komisarzu.
Madam President, Commissioner, right now we are discussing the budget for 2018. We need to keep in mind that 2018 will be a time of very hard work on the next multi-annual financial framework, but also very hard work on negotiations with the UK. This will also be a year where we will be looking at the results of the midterm review which we proposed as a parliament, which on the one hand increased the budget's flexibility and on the other hand did not tie the hands of the legislators. So the discussions on the budget for 2018, which was very difficult, very complex, give us reason to think that the next negotiations on the future MFF will be carried out in a spirit of cooperation and mutual trust. This is very important for us. Will the Commission cooperate with the Parliament when preparing the budget, and will the Council be flexible and open enough to treat the Parliament not only as the body that is supposed to approve the budget in the end, but somebody to cooperate with? The outcome of the negotiations of the 2018 budget, which is not satisfactory to everyone, but is nevertheless a success, shows that this will be possible, that we will next year no longer spend money from the 2018 budget, but work together on the new financial perspective for post-2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albrecht. And now I give the floor for a minute to Mr. Manuel dos Santos, please.
Obrigado, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The 2018 budget is seeking to set incentives. I'm not saying necessarily a better or a worse framework than we had before, but it is absolutely vital that Parliament and Council and Commission reflect on how we can improve the budget procedure. We need to undertake a political decision to establish payment, expenditure and revenue. We need to set priorities. We need to have a very thorough rethink, difficult as it may be. This applies also for 2018. There were long negotiations and discussions during the budget procedure, and I would propose, Madam President, that despite efforts on part of the Council, it was possible to respect the informal interinstitutional agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dos Santos. And the next speaker is Lefteris Christophorou. 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. We have to congratulate the rapporteur of the budget, Mr. Muresan, and the rest of the budget group for their achievements in this budget. They have managed to turn the budget in a more social direction by securing more funds for the youth, for innovation, for the Erasmus program. This budget is a budget that is being funded by the taxpayers, and the European taxpayers demand that each euro of this budget goes to actions that respect the values of the European Union. It is not possible to fund countries that do not respect the values of the EU. On the contrary, they violate them in every conceivable way. I think it is a very important step that there were cutbacks on the funds for Turkey. Turkey every day insults the positions of the European Parliament. It is the country that is violating human rights at home and abroad in Cyprus. It does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus. They have troops on our ground. They have stopped the talks, and it is unthinkable that we give even €1 to Turkey. I am not going to vote in favor of giving even €1 to Turkey and other such countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christoforou. And now I give the floor to Mr. Jens Geier. You have a minute, please.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, as the standing rapporteur for the agencies, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the rapporteur team, especially Mr. Mureşan, who as General Rapporteur supported me, and I felt wonderfully represented by Mr. Mureşan, and he used every opportunity to represent strongly the agencies responsible for policing, border management and fighting terrorism have been well supported, and more funding has been made available for GSA, and I look forward to Galileo and other satellite networks of the EU becoming operable, because I think that will really be a shot in the arm for Europe. But every year, ladies and gentlemen, we have the same problem again and again. The MFF doesn't work. The financial challenges faced by the EU now were not predictable in 2013. The Trust Fund and the Turkey Refugee Facility emphasise that, and unfortunately member states are not empowered to change that, and so they're forced into ploys that I would describe as budget voodoo. I think the only solution is more own resources. Thank you.
Kiitos, herra Geier.
Thank you, Mr. Geier. Now I give the floor to Mr. Sean Kelly for 2 minutes, please.
I'm delighted to talk about the 2018 budget and the fact that we're talking about an increase rather than a decrease. Decrease is what the Council wanted, the Parliament wanted an increase, and the Parliament won in this case, which does show that we have some power.
Originally introduced in the Council position, that now has been reversed, as well as success of the European Parliament in mobilising an additional €104.1 million through the global margin for commitments. I think this is very important because it will cover initiatives proposed by the Parliament, especially on areas close to my heart: Horizon 2020, Erasmus, COSME and Interrail. These are largely new allocations, which I particularly welcome, given the Council's overarching focus on cuts as the only option in accordance with the political declaration signed in the context of the MFF mid-term revision. However, Horizon 2020 has brought significant technological progress, not least in clean energy technologies, that will help us to meet our targets, and this is the best return of all commitments we have. Erasmus has massive uptake in my own country in particular, as more and more students gain experience that previous generations could not even have imagined by spending time in different member states. COSME is supporting a significant number of the SMEs that are the lifeblood of our economy. I also very much welcome allocation for the Youth Employment Initiative, increasing it to €350 million. And I think this is a wonderful development, and a potential increase is also mentioned in due course. And then finally, I want to say I'm very pleased that the European Parliament has dealt with important issues to me, especially in my country, on young farmers, an increase of €34 million, climate, an increase of €95 million, and milk storage, an increase of €2 million. A great job. Rapporteurs deserve our praise and our gratitude.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. And next, Vladimir Manka, 1 minute. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yesterday we have the 9th round, and tonight we're having the 10th round of trilogue for the simplification of budgetary rules, which are closely connected to this budget as well. The European Parliament and the Commission, we both want, for those who accept EU money, EU funds, so that they're not able to use various shell companies and structures, dodging tax obligations, using various aggressive tax practices, not sticking to the criteria of sound tax administration. We also want to ensure that the EU funds can only be drawn by entities in those jurisdictions who apply the international rules when it comes to tax norms in terms of transparency and exchange of information. The Council is not quite following our line in this. I believe that the Estonian government has a different opinion than those member states who are trying to avoid this kind of protection of EU financial interests. Therefore, I'd like to ask the Estonian presidency to point out to the member states in the Council that if we want to increase the living standards of our citizens, if we want to prevent money being lost from our coffers, if we want to regain trust, we need to change words into actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maika. And the next speaker is Mr. Jean-Paul Denanot. 1 minute. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the colleagues in my political group who defended our priorities during the conciliation procedure in a climate which was difficult, facing up to a council which isn't too consistent and doesn't face up to its responsibilities. But today, well, I feel sorry for my Europe. The European Parliament, of course, has obtained some progress under heading 1, Erasmus, employment for young people, and under 2, to install young farmers. But this is only a drop in the ocean of these needs that we talk about so often in this House. These new policies which are so often relevant that Council puts to us without the necessary shoring up means that we have to take from one to feed another. So every year it's the same process, and every year we give in. I'm sorry. Today, the only weapon that we have to try to get things going and to assume responsibilities is to not vote in favor of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denanot. And you were the last speaker, but now we can move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. And first I'd like to give the floor to John Howarth. You have the floor.
The European Union budget is indeed like Christmas in that it comes round at the same time every year. And I would say to the Council, in thanking everyone for their work, the least we can do when we know that the budget is coming around at the same time every year is come to the negotiations with a proper mandate so that we can make progress in a business-like fashion. And I hope that will be taken on in the future. You can't have everything in a budget, but I would welcome much of the progress that was made, particularly in areas such as youth and employment, which remain particularly urgent. And I would say, however, to the Commissioner, where there are issues perhaps with take-up, I hope he would undertake to look urgently at how these programmes can be simplified in the future. And I also welcome the progress on Horizon 2020 and Erasmus. This isn't remote stuff. This is real research, real student educated, real lives transformed, real lives saved through that research, and new frontiers of humanity pushed forward.
Thank you, Mr. Howarth. And next up is Honourable Member Doru Claudio Frunzulica. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, in the context of the debate and vote in the EP Ministerial on the 2018 budget procedure, I completely support the results and agreement of the EU Budget Conciliation Committee for 2018. The joint conclusions on the 2018 budget were negotiated and adopted in the Conciliation Committee of the EP on 18th of November in the morning. Therefore, the document reflects the priority of my country as well, of Romania, like, for example, the adequate provision of resources for the financing of the cohesion policy and common agriculture policy in 2018. The agreement is an important one because it includes payment of 46.5 5 billion for cohesion policy funding, subchapter 1b, payments that will cover the volume of applications that will be sent for payment from the EU budget in 2018. This is so important for Central Eastern European Union members. During the negotiations, there was a higher risk of reducing payment appropriations in the case of cohesion policy. However, payments could be protected and adapted at a level close to that proposed by the common agricultural policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Frunzulica, you could speak a bit slower, please. That's a lot of facts for 1 minute, but if you speak a bit slower, then the interpreters can keep up. Next is Mr. Eleftherios Synadinos. 1 minute, you have the floor.
The draft budget of the EU will be approved, and the proof of that is that the ceremony has already been planned right after the vote. However, this is not the worst part of this tragic comedy. The political elite wants to spend funds in the most powerful member states, as well as in member states that are pressing through illegal immigration. Big words and propaganda do not lead to lower unemployment in the less developed countries. It is, I would say, criminally insane to follow the same policies and expect different results. The citizens are against this kind of union. We need to take into account the needs of the citizens. Otherwise, in a few years, the peoples of Europe will be strangers in this continent.
Thank you, Mr. Synadinos. The next speaker is Madam Monika Benova. You have the floor. 1 minute.
Thank you for the floor. Commissioner, dear colleagues, I would like to say that I really appreciate the work that you've done on the budget for 2018, especially regarding the chapters treating with the topic of fight against terrorism, migration crisis, support for the youth, Erasmus, or generally the program supporting youth employment. Young people need to see their perspective within the EU, and it's very good that we have managed to increase money in these chapters. However, it would be good if the Commission veiled or if they were watching how the funds are used, the implementation of the funds, especially in the cohesion fund. And last but not least, as already a previous speaker has said, what kind of companies participate, what kind of companies draw on the European funds. Are they real companies or are they only letterbox companies? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Benova. The next speaker is Mr. Marias. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We are discussing the budget of the EU that is financing with large amounts of money countries that do not respect the values of the EU. This budget is funding Turkey, which is threatening Greece with casus belli if we move ahead and extend our territorial waters to 12 nautical miles. Turkey is violating the Greek territorial waters every day. They are desecrating the Hagia Sophia Church. They are pushing thousands of illegal migrants onto the islands of the Aegean. They have invaded Cyprus and they are occupying 37% of the Republic of Cyprus. At the same time, the budget of the EU is financing Albania, that is trampling upon the rights of the Greek ethnic minority in southern Albania. They are tearing down their houses in Himara, and they're also claiming Greek territory. So I'm not going to vote in favor of this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marias. The next speaker is Tibor Jani.
Thank you. Madam President, for giving me the floor. There is no budget on earth which would satisfy everyone. But we have heard pros and cons in regard of this budget. I'd like to focus on the pros and the new phenomena that this budget harbors. For instance, the Smart Villages program or initiative, which features for the first time in the EU budget in a preparatory action. I believe that at a time, in a context when only 6% of those employed in agriculture are young people, so we are talking about an aging population in agriculture, although the food supplies of Europe are at a very high stake. This initiative is extremely important, and I'm very thankful to Mr. Mureşan and the others who promoted this idea.
Thank you, Mr. Gianni. And the last speaker in the Catch the Eye procedure is Madam Kristina Morvai. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Mr. Oettinger, I would like to address you. Your name is very familiar to everybody in Hungary because you admitted something phenomenal. Looking at Hungary and other former communist countries that receive cohesion funds from the EU, these countries practically send this money back to multinational companies from the Western world. This money coming from the EU ends up with these Western companies. The EU wanted to punish us to take away this money from us, and then Mr. Oettinger said, oh, God save us from doing that, because then we would be punishing the multinationals who get this money. I would like to ask your opinion about the budget for 2018. Have you carried out an impact assessment? What is the impact of this budget on the multinationals, the cohesion policy, and so on? There are huge gaps in welfare between the West and the East. Is this budget reducing the differences between East and West?
Thank you, Madam Morvai. And now, in the 2018 budgetary procedure, we can go to the final remarks, and first up is Commissioner Oettinger. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, we've taken good note of the many and varied statements that have been made, and taken note of what's been said about the way the budget is implemented, and we've also heard good advice for how to reorganise the financial framework for the next decade. I don't think that we can say that the current financial framework isn't working. Thanks to flexibility and other instruments, we are able, despite all of the problems, to come through with the necessary funding for the most important issues. But of course, we can learn from our experience with this financial framework for the future. We can try to integrate external funds and instruments into the budget to strengthen parliamentary privilege over these. And secondly, try to measure total revenue and try to better anticipate expenditure, although of course unforeseen needs may arise over a period of 7 years. So there's been some support to the framework, but there's been some harsh criticism. I'll just respond to one of the harsh criticisms. Some people, now absent, have referred to the Brexit decisions. I mean, there's no agreement that has been reached yet. What we have is a budget framework that applies until the end of 2020 that was unanimously adopted. It was supported and agreed to in 2013 by the representative of the British government. And that framework covers commitments and payments and revenue. And if in this particular year of the financial framework, we undertake commitments to spend on infrastructure, building new railways, new roads, or investing in new research projects, then we have to expect that all the 28 member states contribute their share during this financial framework, so that the unanimously decided expenditure can still take place even after the withdrawal of a member state. I think that's all that's the least you can expect in the name of fairness. The financial framework requires unanimity to be adopted, and the UK government supported that all the way through to 2020. Now, I think the budget can claim to provide added value of all kinds. We are investing and creating added value by investing at the European level and not just the individual member state level. For example, research projects in a dynamic world of research, ranging from Silicon Valley, Shanghai. We look throughout the world. You need to ensure that we work together, because no one single member state alone is able to react to the rapid developments taking place in research and technology in the world. We've got Delft, Grenoble, Munich, Oxford, Cambridge working together, plus industry, to try to keep Europe at the leading edge where it should be, and help us to catch up where we're lagging behind. This alone would be impossible for one single member state on their own, and it's good for, of course, European competitiveness and jobs in Europe. And a second example, cohesion. As a citizen of a net contributor to the EU budget, I am proud that German citizens are paying into the EU budget for projects that will range across Europe, from Bulgaria to Portugal, because of course GDP per capita varies enormously from one member state to another, and we don't want that to lead to hostility and rivalry. That's why we need cohesion policy to reduce these disparities. We need to bring up the countries that are lagging behind. That is a clear task of a continent of solidarity that creates peace across cultural and linguistic differences. I think this is an important goal, and I think we can all be proud of contributing to that, regardless of where we come from, how well off we are. And a third example, no member state alone can achieve something in terms of climate protection. And this was recently evident in Copenhagen, where we didn't have a clear strategy and a clear mandate. And the example of the opposite was in Paris, when we finally did have a clear mandate, where we were able to achieve clear goals together. And precisely our British colleagues, who have these climate goals very close to their hearts, must understand that without the European Union, Europe would not be able to make its voice heard in the whole debate on climate change. And another example that I'd like to cite is this: the much criticized agriculture budget. You can say all sorts of things about improving greening and climate protection, but we're just talking about 30 cents per EU citizen per day in return for healthy food, sufficient food, and maintaining jobs in rural areas. That just costs 30 cents per citizen per day. I think that is a worthwhile item of expenditure in the EU budget, which is of great benefit to all of those who want to have access to regional food and healthy, high-quality food and drink. And I could cite many other examples. But I'll now conclude. Of course, we can make savings in the EU budget, but we have to bear in mind that of, say, every €100 that our citizens earn with their hard work, or their hands or their heads, 40 to 50 euros go into the public coffers. And of that 40 to 50 euros that go to their national government, 1 comes to Europe. But the vast majority is going to London, Paris, Rome, Tallinn, to local authorities. So we only represent 1/40th or 1/50th of public spending. So actually, we're very economical as an institution. So when you argue against propaganda and you call the House of European History a house of horrors, I think anybody who labels it in that way lives in, just on another planet.
Commissary Oettinger.
Thank you, Commissioner Oettinger. Next up is the Council. Matti Maasikas, you have the floor.
Kiitos puheenjohtaja. Honourable members, Commissioner Oettinger, thank you very much for this very interesting exchange of views that has shown that despite some differences, quite natural, we are united in our commitment to making progress for the benefit of Europe and its citizens. The negotiations on the 2018 budget took place under complex circumstances, and I also, in my introductory remarks, refer to some discussions not only between the delegations, but within the delegations. In spite of this, we worked together in a constructive manner and were able to reconcile our positions on how to finance the different priorities and actions of the Union. I am convinced that the agreement reached is a good and balanced result, allowing the Union to act and to react to the various needs. Thank you very much once more and wish you wisdom for tomorrow's vote. Thank you.
Kiitos oikein paljon.
Thank you very much, Matti Maasikas. And to finish, we will hear the chair of the Budget Committee, Jean Arthuis. You have the floor.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, here we are at the end of a debate which has been extremely interesting on the draft budget for the European Union for 2018. And I would like to thank the Minister Maasikas for having recalled that over these last 3 years we have reached agreement in the European Parliament. There was the idea that we would fail every second year. And we did fail at the end of 2014 for the budget for 2015, but it's not enough to fail to get a better budget. And what I recall from that is that the version developed by the Commission at that time did not bring about the significant changes that we wanted. When you fight, you have to go right to the very end. And I didn't find the necessary supports that we might have received. And having said that, I'd like to convince my colleagues who have intimated that they might abstain tomorrow. I'd like to be sure that there's not some misunderstanding here. First of all, Mr. Viotti might be grateful that we have seen to it that this midterm review of the MFF is not a Bible, intangible. On the contrary, and we've demonstrated this. Mr. Viotti will be the General Rapporteur next year, and he will appreciate that we've made this demonstration. Mrs. Thomas, I'd like to try to convince her. First of all, on one point, you said that there weren't enough appropriations for humanitarian aid. And if I would have a slight criticism to make of our Commissioner, it is that he could have, during the conciliation, said that he was preparing to transfer 62 million taken from pre-accession from Turkey and placed it for humanitarian aid. Now, all I want to say with this argument that could reassure Madame Thomas and convince her that he ought to vote in favour of this draft budget. Second thing, she said that on the Youth Employment Initiative, she fears the footnotes. And last year there was a footnote, but that's disappeared. There's been no restriction placed on this from the Commission on the amendment of 116 million, which was passed, which was accepted. So there's no restriction, Mrs. Thomas. So I'm just saying this, and I'd just like to say that our budget, dear colleagues, is 1% of the EU's GNI, and that in this budget, 80% is pre-allocated either for the CAP or the cohesion funds, country by country, and also to the institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, the Court of Justice, the Court of Auditors, and a certain number of other institutions. So I place my trust in the Commission. The commitments have been undertaken for the ECJ, and I'm sure they will be respected. And I've heard the undertakings concerning what Mr. Dupré said on the aid to be given to the victims of terrorist attacks. I place my trust in the Commission, and for those of us who would have hesitated, I might recommend that tomorrow you vote in favour of this budget for 2018. This would be of calmly preparing the next MFF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arthuis, President of the Budgetary Committee. And that concludes our discussion, our debate, and we will vote tomorrow. We can move to the next point on the agenda. And it is the Commission statement on the state of the energy union in 2017 and the decision